random, totally random ways gives rise to the diversity that we need to make us immune, or at least protectable, to virtually anything that we might encounter during our lifetime. Say, basically bulletproof. The only time that we get sick is if something's not functioning properly. As long as it's functioning properly, we'll be protected. Higher order random design. So the result then, with random design and also higher order random design, we have diversity, complexity, opportunity, and ultimately vitality for all of life. One of the big, so I'm going to shift gears here now for a moment. One of the big questions that I have often is, I don't like the title of your book. Because the random designer, in my view, is God. And there's just something about this idea of random. We attach this negative connotation to it. Let me describe to you where I'm coming from. Because as I suggested to you last time, sometimes we have to be willing to look a little bit deeper to see a deeper meaning. A couple ways that I look at this concept of random design and random designer. First of all, we need to look at a definition of what random really means. And I think you all know what you think it means. If you look in Webster's dictionary, you'll see a definition that would probably fit yours, sort of like purposeless, haphazard. That's sort of the definition that we see thrown around. But if you look in that same Webster's dictionary, there's point number 2. An alternative definition of random. And this definition goes like this. It says, being a part of a set that has equal opportunity of occurrence. Equal opportunity of occurrence. So now if you take that definition, this is sort of the mathematical definition. I guess you'd expect that from a scientist. If you take that definition and substitute it into the title of the book, Random Designer, we now have equal opportunity designer. That sounds so warm and fuzzy. Second thing relating to the definition and the interpretation of random designer and the word random is that we need to be careful how we use these things. For example, if you describe an engineer as an electrical engineer, that does not necessarily mean that that engineer is electrical. It just means that he uses electrical processes to carry out his work and his creative projects. And in the same way, random designer does not imply in any way that God is somehow random. It just means that he is able to harness the forces of randomness to accomplish his creative purposes. Let's look at, now that as a background, let's look at this idea of God being a random designer. I start with the assumption that I suspect most of you start with as well, that God is real. But it's an assumption. Sometimes people think that because I'm a scientist and scientists are supposed to know everything, that somehow I would prove God with my science. I can't do that. I tried. It doesn't work. And so I start with the basic assumption that God is real. And then onto that, the observation that we see in the created order that random processes are integral components which drive the formation of his created order. Remember, random design has two components. The forces of randomness driving it and the generation of multiple complex options, virtually limitless. These things are verifiable observations that we can describe all day long in lots of different areas of science. So, the conclusion of the matter, since God ordains processes which utilize and embody elements of randomness to create, this therefore, by definition, is not random at all. It's a design. It's a part of his design. It's random design. It would be like if I can create a process that random number generates something, and I know that if I do enough of them, I'll finally get the one that I might be able to use, and I do another one over here, another one over here, and I can put them all together, I'm the creator. That doesn't detract from me. That adds to me. That shows that I can use even the forces of randomness to create. Remember last time I said to you, I, like you, see God in the order of our world. We all can see that. But when we begin to look a little more closely, we begin to see that God is also working in the disorder. So, random design, the creative tool of the random, that is, equal opportunity designer. Okay, so what's the value of random design in creation? It's really, I've sort of implied it already, unlimited potential. Isn't that the kind of God that we've always said that we served? One that was limitless, who could do anything? Unlimited options, anything possible, no boundary, unrivaled creativeness. When we look at it up close, we find that life's creation mechanisms are, well, they're a little bit they're a whole lot inefficient. Sometimes paradoxical, doesn't quite make sense, self-perpetuating, automatic, and profoundly complex. Yet, on the other hand, life's creation mechanisms are exquisitely productive, and most of all, effective. And I believe from the hand of God. I know this is a bold statement. I wrote it a couple of years ago, and I showed it to Max, and he just sort of sucked his breath in, Max Reams, and yet the longer I look at it, the more convinced that that's it. Random design appears to be the best and perhaps the only method capable of accomplishing the enormous task of creating, developing, and sustaining life. It's a tough task to be able to create everything that's needed to allow life to continue. Random design appears to be the only mechanism that I've ever been able to see that could possibly do that. Okay, I'd like to shift gears now to the next topic, and this was, as I wrote the book, I think I shared perhaps with you or the other group in the last session that the content of Random Designer is not very difficult scientifically. Could probably knock it off in a couple of weeks and lay it out if I were talking to a scientific crowd. But I wanted Random Designer to be accessible to a broad audience. Not just the religious, but also the non-religious. Not just the scientists, but also the non-scientists. And if it's within the scientists, not just the biological sciences, but also the chemists and the physicists. And even within biology, did you know that there are some biologists who don't know much about this stuff at all? Because that's not their field of specialization. And so, realistically, the issues of science and faith are issues that affect us all. They're not issues that just affect theologians and just affect scientists. And I wanted Random Designer to be broadly accessible to virtually everyone. That's what took me 4 years to write it. There are, however, some groups that I particularly wanted to make sure that the message would be heard. First, there's a group of Christians who I would say they need to hear the messages of Random Designer, but they will probably never listen. I hope that they will, but it's not my job to persuade. It's just my job to inform. And we'll see what happens with that. The second group of individuals I wanted to hear the message of Random Designer are a group of Christians, people of faith, who have been looking for the message of Random Designer their whole life. They've been looking for a way to put issues of science and issues of faith together in an intellectually and personally satisfying way. In the third group, which is really, I've listed it last, but is really the most important group that I wanted to touch with the message of Random Designer, were the non-believers. Those people outside of faith. Those people right on the edge of faith, perhaps, or even perhaps not on the edge of faith, who have been told, for one reason or another, that you cannot believe science and also hold on to your faith, that they are somehow incompatible.